I remember how Evelyn Reed arrived on a grey morning that smelled of wet soil and faint tulip buds from the garden behind room 9B. The rain had passed, but the air still held on to it, like a memory unwilling to let go. I had reviewed her file earlier that morning. Metastatic pancreatic cancer, unresponsive to treatment, with an estimated timeline of weeks, maybe days. But the paper never told the whole story. Only their eyes did. She was wheeled in by her daughter, a woman I guessed was in her 40s, pale from stress, dressed too lightly for the weather. I didn't ask many questions that day. I rarely did during admissions. People carried more in their faces than their words could convey. Evelyn was small, delicate-looking, with thinning silver hair tucked behind her ears. Her eyes were alert, though bright in a way that didn't match the rest of her body. I had seen hundreds like her, but something about the way she looked out the window as we placed her in bed told me she wasn't afraid. Not in the usual way. She was preparing for something, not fleeing from it. That readiness, when it appears, is unmistakable. Her first day was quiet. She didn't ask for anything, didn't complain. When I stopped in to check her vitals, she nodded politely, said thank you, and returned her gaze to the sky beyond the window. That kind of calm was rare. Most patients talked, asked about the process, tried to grip something they were losing. Evelyn simply observed. By the third day, she asked for music. Not through a speaker system or a TV channel, but from a phone, something soft. She named a song. I found it. The moment the melody began, her expression shifted. Her fingers, so still until then, curled faintly inward. Her breathing steadied. When it ended, she looked up at me and gave a single nod. That was all. No commentary. No small talk. Just recognition that something unfinished had now been acknowledged. Later, she asked for mint chocolate chip ice cream. Not just any kind. She specified that it should be white, not green. The distinction mattered. I made a note and called 3 stores before finding one that carried the brand she described. When I brought it to her room, she took one bite, then paused. Her eyes closed. The silence that followed was thicker than words. She finished the bowl slowly, like she was savouring something far more than flavour. When she handed the empty dish back, she said nothing. Her condition began to decline the following week, breathing more shallow, appetite smaller, but her awareness remained. One afternoon, she requested to be taken outside to watch the sunset. It was an unusual request, considering her oxygen dependency and our facility's policy on late-hour movements, but we made an exception. I wheeled her through the corridor, past the quiet nurses' station, out into the small garden behind the west wing. The air was cool, the sky was turning, reds into golds, golds into deep violet. She didn't say a word. She sat there in silence, watching the sun lower behind the row of pines. I stood behind her, arms folded, unsure whether to speak or stay still. I chose stillness. When it ended, she signalled with her hand. We returned to her room. The following day, she asked me to read to her. No television, no background noise, just the sound of words. I brought an old copy of Wuthering Heights from my office. It was a personal copy, the pages soft from use. I read slowly. She lay back, eyes closed, but I knew she was listening. When I paused, she slightly nodded, asking me to go on. I continued until the chapter ended. She never asked again, but every afternoon afterward, I would enter and begin reading without prompt. One morning, her daughter arrived earlier than usual. I met her in the hallway. She said Evelyn hadn't spoken much that morning, only smiled and stared at the window. The signs were there. The final shift. When patients stop eating, when their eyes begin to turn inward, when the rhythm of their chest changes, you begin to count in moments, not days. I sat with her for a long time that day. She didn't move. Her hand, resting above the blanket, twitched once. I held it. We listened to the wind moving through the open slit of the window. Just before dusk, her breathing slowed, then paused, then returned for one last breath, long, deep, and quiet. And then nothing. I stayed there beside her for 15 minutes. No nurse entered, no phone rang. There was only the room, the quiet, and the scent of tulips from the open garden door. I stayed until the light outside faded completely. The shadows stretched across the floor, long and blue, folding into the corners of the room like the end of a page. I hadn't moved. Her hand was still in mine. It was warm, but that warmth was beginning to fade, slowly, inevitably. I'd been through this moment countless times before, each one different, each one the same. The body rests, the spirit departs, and the room becomes just a room again. But with Evelyn, something lingered. Not in a haunting sense, no. It was peace that remained, something rare and sacred in this place. Some patients go with struggle, some in silence, some with a whisper of regret. Evelyn had left with completeness. I stood, placed her hand gently across her chest, and tucked the blanket under her arms. Then I closed the window. The breeze had cooled, and the scent of evening rain had returned. I turned off the overhead light and left only the small lamp burning in the corner. Its soft amber glow was enough. In the hallway I found Laura sitting alone. She stood when she saw me, eyes full of hope that had already broken. "She's gone," I said softly. Her shoulders collapsed forward. She didn't cry, not right away. Just stood there, arms crossed tightly, as if trying to hold herself together. "Was she scared?" she asked. "No," I said. "She was ready. She did everything she needed." Laura nodded slowly. She didn't speak again for several minutes. Then, almost in a whisper, she said, "She told me she had 5 things she wanted to do. She wouldn't tell me what they were, only that she had help." "She did," I said. She reached out, took my hand, and held it longer than most families usually do. "Thank you," she said. That night I didn't go home right away. I sat in the break room, long after the nurses had changed shifts. My stethoscope lay on the table beside a half-empty cup of coffee. I stared at it, at the symbol of a profession so often caught in the rush to cure, to save. But here in this quiet corner of the medical world, the job was different. We weren't here to save time. We were here to honor it. Evelyn reminded me of that. I returned to her room once more before the night crew prepared her for transport. The book I'd been reading to her still sat on the nightstand, a silk bookmark tucked at the last page I read aloud. I opened it, glanced at the passage, and whispered the words again into the empty room. There was no answer, only peace. The next morning her bed was empty, the linens fresh, the window open once more. The scent of tulips came in with the breeze, and a single robin landed on the branch just outside the sill. It chirped once, then flew off. I stood there for a long moment, watching the branch sway in its absence. Evelyn Reed had passed, but something of her remained, in the silence, in the air, in the stillness of the room, and in me. I walked back to my office in silence, the soles of my shoes tapping lightly on the linoleum, echoing through the empty morning corridor. The weight of her absence was present in every step. Not heavy, not like grief, more like the lingering impression of something meaningful that had ended exactly as it should have. I opened my door and sat at my desk. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden hue across the blinds. I didn't turn on the lights. I let the early light settle in the room, warm and slow. There's a small notebook I keep in the top drawer of my desk. I started it years ago. Not a journal, not really. Just pages filled with names and dates, short thoughts, small reflections. Not for anyone else, just for me, for the weight of this work, for the names I didn't want to lose to time. I opened to a blank page. Evelyn Reed. 5 wishes. Moon River. Real mint ice cream. A garden sunset. Words spoken aloud. Peace without asking for permission. I paused, the pen resting against the edge of the paper. Then I wrote one more line. She remembered how to say goodbye. The hallway outside my office grew louder as the day shift arrived. Coffee cups, quiet conversations, beeping monitors warming up. Life moving on, as it always does. But I didn't get up. Not yet. There's a stillness that lives inside you when you've witnessed someone pass with purpose. Not just from disease, not just from age, but with intent. Evelyn had left like a teacher closing a classroom for the last time. Chairs pushed in, windows shut, chalk washed clean from the board. I closed the notebook gently and slid it back into the drawer. Later that day, a new file appeared on my desk. Another patient. Another room. Another name. It's always like that. No time to linger too long. You carry them with you, but you move forward, because the next person will need you just as much. Still, as I read the file, I glanced once more at the garden outside. The trees were swaying lightly. The sky, now clear, was bright and deep, and for a moment I imagined Evelyn there again, sitting quietly, letting the sun warm her face. That's how I would choose to remember her. Not in a bed, not in silence, but in that garden, with the last colours of the sky wrapping around her shoulders, eyes open, present, whole. I turned back to the file. The name was Margaret Dunning. 76 years old, advanced COPD, transferred from County General. I closed the folder and stood. Another story was beginning, another final chapter waiting to be written, and I would be there for it, just as I had been for Evelyn. Room 12B was at the far end of the west corridor, just past the supply closet and beneath the old vent that rattled in the winter. I'd always thought the room was too quiet, tucked away from the natural rhythm of the ward, but perhaps for Margaret it would be just right. I stopped outside the door for a moment before entering. This is something I often do: pause, breathe, prepare myself not for what I'll see, but for what I'll feel. Each patient carries their own weight, and I've learned the importance of meeting that weight with an open heart, not just clinical knowledge. Inside, Margaret sat upright in bed. Her back was thin, shoulders rounded, as if years of breathlessness had forced her to fold inward. She turned her head as I entered. Her eyes were sharp, a cool grey that reminded me of thunderclouds. There was a certain clarity in them, not unlike Evelyn's, but laced with something else: wariness. She didn't speak immediately, and neither did I. I simply stepped closer, checked her oxygen levels, the IV, made a mental note of her colour, her hands, the slight tremor in her fingers. Then I met her eyes. "I'm Dr. Ellison," I said softly. "I'll be taking care of you." Her expression didn't shift, but she nodded once. That was enough for now. Margaret didn't come with a daughter or a husband or anyone, just a volunteer driver and a single overnight bag, light enough to carry in one hand. No photos, no books, no flowers. The file mentioned she had no living relatives. Estranged from her son for over a decade, friends, none listed. I've seen loneliness come in many forms. Margaret's was the quiet, settled kind. Not the frantic grasping of someone newly abandoned, but the slow, resigned kind of solitude that seeps into the bones. It wraps around people like a shawl, keeps them warm, but isolates them all the same. The first few days, she said very little. I stopped by morning and evening, adjusted her meds, monitored her breathing. She tolerated me. That's the word I would use. She didn't push me away, but she didn't invite me in either. It was on the fourth evening that something shifted. I was making my final rounds when I passed her room and saw the lights still on. Most patients by then are asleep or pretending to be. Margaret sat upright, staring at nothing, a half-empty glass of water on her tray. The oxygen hissed quietly at her side. I knocked once, gently, then stepped in. "Can't sleep?" I asked. She shook her head. "Do you want something to help?" Another shake. I stood quietly for a moment, unsure if I should stay or go. Then she said, "Do you ever get used to watching people disappear?" The question landed heavily in the room. "No," I said. "I don't think anyone ever truly does." She nodded, satisfied somehow with that answer. "I watched my mother go," she said after a while, "in a place like this, though not quite as clean. She died during a snowstorm. Power went out. We lit candles." I didn't interrupt. "She was a bitter woman," Margaret continued, "but when the lights went out and there was nothing but flickering flame and silence, she cried, not from pain, just from knowing it was the end. And I held her hand. We weren't close, but I held it anyway." She looked over at me then. "Strange what you remember." "Not strange," I said. "Important." We sat in silence for a long while after that. I didn't look at my watch, didn't think about the next patient. In that moment, Margaret was all there was. Before I left the room, she said, "If I ask for something before I go, will you do it?" "Yes," I said, "even if it seems foolish." "Especially then." She looked back toward the window. "I'll think about what it is," she said, and I knew she meant it. Morning, Margaret didn't speak when I came in. She simply looked at me, nodded once, and turned her eyes back toward the window. There was something brewing behind them, something that hadn't settled yet. I didn't press. Wishes, in this place, often arrive slowly, not in grand declarations, but in fragments, pieces of memory sifting their way to the surface. By afternoon, she asked for tea. Not from the staff kitchen, not the bland herbal stuff we usually served. "Real tea," she said, "loose leaves, strong, Assam or Darjeeling, in a proper mug, not one of those paper things." I made a note. After my shift ended, I stopped by a small shop near the edge of town. The woman behind the counter pointed me to a tin labelled Golden Assam. I bought it, along with a ceramic mug with a small blue pattern at the rim, the kind of detail I knew Margaret would appreciate. The next morning, I brought it in myself. Hot, steeped just right. She didn't say thank you, but when she took the first sip, she closed her eyes, let the warmth linger. Better than I remembered, she said, and that was all. That was the beginning. Every morning after that, I brought her tea. Some days she drank it in silence. Other days she spoke, small fragments of stories, pieces of a life slowly being unfolded like pages too long left unread. She told me about her garden in Vermont, where roses once climbed the walls of a crumbling stone shed. About the dog she had during college, a golden spaniel named Thistle, who used to dig holes under her neighbour's fence. She spoke of her husband David, who died young, long before they had a chance to grow old together, and eventually she spoke of her son. He was 17 when he left, she said one morning. Didn't say goodbye, took his guitar and a backpack and walked out. I hadn't seen him since. There was no bitterness in her voice, just the quiet rhythm of regret that had aged into acceptance. I wrote him letters for the first 3 years, she added, never mailed them. I listened. That's all I did. In this work, listening is more powerful than any prescription. Later that week, she asked me if it was possible to hear a record. Not music from a phone, she said. Vinyl, a turntable, I want to hear the crackle. We didn't have one in the hospice, but I had one at home, an old Technics deck my father left me. Still worked. Still sounded like memory. That evening I brought it in, along with a few of my own records, unsure of what she might want. But when she saw the cover of one particular album, Ella Fitzgerald, Live in Berlin, her lips parted slightly. She used to be on the radio all the time, Margaret said. When I was a girl, my father would hum along thinking he knew the words. He didn't. I set it up on the small table near her bed, dropped the needle gently. The room filled with warmth. Not just sound, warmth, that crackle, that voice, the slow drift of strings and brass. Margaret closed her eyes, and I saw her lips move, barely, following the melody, as if the song had been waiting all this time to find her again. She listened to the whole side. When it ended, she asked me not to speak. Not yet. Just let it be. So I sat beside her, both of us in silence, the needle resting at the centre of the record, clicking faintly as it spun. The next morning, she said, that was one. I didn't ask what she meant. I'd heard those words before. Later, she asked if I still had the mug. The blue-rimmed one. I told her I did. That was 2, she said. Margaret's body was growing weaker, but her eyes grew clearer. It happens sometimes. The closer they get to the end, the more focused their gaze becomes. Not on the world outside, but on something inside. Something that needs resolution. The third request came unexpectedly. She wanted to sit in the hallway. Not the garden, not the lounge. Just the hallway. It's where the life is, she said. The quiet steps, the rustle of charts, that old vent that rattles sometimes. I just want to sit in it for a while. It seemed simple, but the logistics were trickier than one might expect. Her oxygen, her IV, the narrowness of the corridor. Still, that afternoon, we wheeled her out. Parked her beside the nurses' station, facing the large window that overlooked the maple tree near the staff parking lot. She sat there for 2 hours. Said almost nothing. Watched people pass. Smiled once at a child visiting their grandfather, rested her hand lightly against the chair arm, tapping a quiet rhythm against the wood. When I helped her back into her room, she said, that was 3. Each request, I realized, was a kind of inventory, a personal reckoning, a farewell stitched together with quiet detail. No grand gestures, just the fragments of a life, gathered like fallen leaves. The 4th request came the following day. She wanted to write a letter. Not to her son, not to anyone living. To my younger self, she said. I think she needs to hear from me. I brought in a thick cream-coloured notepad from my home office, the kind that makes the pen feel heavier in your hand. She wrote slowly, her handwriting looping and narrow, pausing often to rest. It took her 3 days. When she finished, she handed me the envelope, sealed, unmarked. Don't read it, she said. I won't. Just hold on to it. I nodded. That's 4. And then there was only 1 left. The final request came at dawn. I arrived early that morning, earlier than usual. Something had stirred me from sleep. No emergency, no message, just an instinct I'd learned to trust after all these years. The kind that whispered, "Today is the day." Margaret was awake, sitting slightly elevated in her bed, her head tilted toward the window, where the sky was just beginning to bleed with light. Pale blue softened the edges of everything. The room was quiet, except for the slow pulse of the oxygen and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. She turned to look at me as I stepped inside. "I thought you'd come," she said, her voice raspier than usual. "I was hoping you would." I sat beside her bed, set my bag down on the chair without a word. She took a slow breath, then closed her eyes. "I want to hear it," she whispered. "Hear what?" "My name. Spoken. Just once, like it mattered." Her words weren't desperate. They weren't even sad. Just simple, final. I leaned in, close enough so only she could hear. "Margaret," I said, "you mattered." She exhaled, deeply, peacefully, like the name itself had been a release. Then softly she said, "That's 5. Her eyes didn't open again after that. She drifted into sleep sometime before the sun fully rose. The light fell across her face in golden ribbons. Her hands were still warm. She was breathing, shallow even. But I knew she was no longer here, in the way we understand presence. She was already halfway gone. I stayed the entire morning. The nurses came in and out. One of them cried quietly in the hallway after stepping out of Margaret's room. She'd only known her a week, but that was long enough. Just before noon, the monitor slowed, then stopped. No alarms, no fanfare. Margaret Dunning was gone. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the sealed envelope she'd given me. I held it for a long time, then placed it inside her file. No one else would ever read it. That was the point. But it would remain there, between the pages of her story. A letter from a woman who remembered who she was, just in time. That afternoon, I returned the record player to my home, cleaned the mug, restocked the tea. Life, as always, moved forward. But Margaret remained, not in the bed she'd left behind, not even in the file that now sat in the archives, but in the hallway where she had listened, in the breath of music that once wrapped around her, in the silence of her final morning when she gave me the gift of trust. I wrote her name in my notebook, Margaret Dunning. Real tea in a blue-rimmed mug, Ella Fitzgerald on vinyl, the quiet hallway, a letter never to be read. Her name spoken gently. 5 wishes, each one a thread in the tapestry of her last days. Each one a reminder that even when a life narrows down to its end, there are still things worth asking for, and people willing to grant them. I closed the notebook and placed it back in my drawer. Then I turned to the next file on my desk,